Hey everyone, Anders Sundquist here, host of the podcast Lean In. And today we're going to lean into the topic of AI in the TA infrastructure and tools landscape. So tune in, take notes if you're investigating implementing some AI into your TA stack or want to learn more about what BrightHire can do. Here with me today, I have Ben Sesser, co-founder, CEO of BrightHire. And BrightHire is the AI co-pilot for exceptional hiring. So grateful for you being on the show, Ben.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, I like to set the stage to start the show of how you got into this space. TA tools, TA tech. So you're co-founder, CEO of BrightHire, but let's rewind a bit. So, what is the journey of your story getting into co-founding BrightHire?
I'll try to give the brief version.
Reader's
Uh,
Digest.
I'll be brief. Now, I've been actually in and around the HR space since college, so a lot of folks kind of fall into the space. But I was actually a labor relations major in college, so studied the HR space, and then was fortunate slash lucky enough to end up at a company called Corporate Executive Board, which was a big public traded research and advisory company that's now part of Gartner. And their big flagship practice area was HR research, supporting CHROs at big companies. And I was a researcher for a little while, and then I ended up doing basically corporate development there. So buying companies, partnering, doing strategy work for the business, and looking at a lot of HR tech products actually in the context of that. And so that's actually what got me into tech, because I realized that the companies that I was buying, what they were doing was much more interesting than I was doing, and I wanted to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
Hit me up.
moved into tech like 15 years ago, not in an HR specific role at the time, but just as an operator. I was, this is my third venture backed company. But in the company prior to BrightHire, it was a venture backed data company, and I was the COO of the business and wore a couple different hats. But one of those was overseeing the people and talent function from, basically Series A to several hundred people. And so BrightHire came out of my, kind of the history of my experience in the HR space, and then firsthand being a people talent leader, scaling a business and seeing that, very clearly hiring was the most important thing we did for our future success. It was
Yeah.
where all of our capital was allocated, and it was really hard, and feeling like there was an opportunity to improve it. And that specifically, the heart of the process was just people talking to each other, making decisions. And that was hard. And the people that did, were involved in hiring, unlike sales or R&D, they don't do it every day. It's not their job, so it's a really hard process that's really important, staffed by an army of volunteers that only do it sometimes.
Yeah.
What felt like a problem to solve. And my co-founder, I've known since kindergarten, like 6 years old.
Wow.
And
Throwback.
he just so happened to have two parents that were in HR for 30 years, spent 7.5 years at LinkedIn. And so, when I was sort of seeing this problem and feeling it firsthand, he was the first call I made to really just talk about the problem itself. It wasn't necessarily that we were going to be dead set on going to start a startup, but we ended up realizing that there was technology that could really help support, tackling the problem that we were focused on.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for the background. Yeah. And certainly, BrightHire is solving problems for customers today at scale. You can look at the landing page, folks, tune in and learn what BrightHire does with the demo. But what I want to talk about today is let's start up at the 30,000 feet, Ben. And so, the TA tech landscape, so the tech stack, the
Yeah.
talent infrastructure, the tooling, if you're listening today, or if you've been a recruiter for some time like myself, started with pen and paper and a phone on your shoulder and resumes in the old drawer. And so a lot has changed since then,
Yep.
right? The evolution and change of job boards and LinkedIn, and then being sold to Microsoft, and now all the tools that we have today. Let's talk a bit about the TA infrastructure landscape, the ecosystem as it is today. Where does BrightHire fit in there?
Yeah. Yeah. I was kind of replaying as you were talking through the journey, I was thinking of sort of names for the eras, and I'm sure other folks have done this before, but, I also remember kind of, folks sticking their hand in the goldfish bowl at the deli where they would give away free sandwiches and just stealing business cards of folks that worked at the companies around there to cold call them
Yeah,
the
the
jobs.
cold call for
Yeah, I'm sure. Anders, I'm not sure if you ever pulled that gambit, but it was a good one.
no,
But
but
there
I
was sort of like,
had a few business cards back in the day. Yeah.
there was like there was like I don't know what you call it, the first era, the manual era, right? And then there was just like the digitization era. So like things like applicant tracking systems and online applications and those sorts of things. And then I would say there was sort of like the basic automation era, where folks were still digitized, or where like the applicant journey was digitized in terms of applications and management, but then there were some sort of like basic automations, to disposition or to sequence to candidates.
Yep.
And now, there's the AI era. I'm sure we'll get into that, but there's like a proliferation of new technology and tools that can solve problems that, you kind of couldn't solve, very well before. BrightHire is what I call like a system of action. So, one of the insights that we had when we started the company was there's actually a lot of really interesting innovation in recruiting technology. There has been for a while. Obviously it's gotten more sophisticated over time, but I was a buyer, right? And so we bought tools that helped us find candidates, whether it was like a network or whatever
Yep.
sequence. And so we bought stuff, and but it seemed like there was a lot of innovation at the top of the funnel, and that once you actually got someone into your hiring process, you had an applicant tracking system, which is very, very important. That's your system of record. That's who's where in the process, keep the trains running on time, collect the data. But the job of hiring actually doesn't happen in an applicant tracking system or in a sourcing tool. The job of hiring, for the most part, if you look at like the overall time spent, is talking to candidates, writing interview feedback, calibrating, talking to them again, making decisions, like that part of the process.
Yep.
And that's where we exist. So post sourcing, we sit on top of an applicant tracking system. That's the system of record. We're the system of action, kind of showing up and making it much easier to do the job of hiring for recruiters, hiring managers, interviewers, day in, day out. So whether that's scoping a role, to figuring out what the interview plan should be, running interviews, gathering feedback, making decisions, sharing context to calibrate along the way as you do. We are showing up in those places in Teams, Meet, Zoom, Slack, chat, email on top of the ATS to make all that work easier. And then we collect a bunch of data on the back end that gives new insight to talent teams. So system of action that rides along the interview process is the kind of the short answer.
Yeah, system of action, and recruiting is certainly a group of action. I guess there's a phrase in tech recruiting, everyone wants a 10x recruiter, who has this 10x output, and how do they get there, and what's their silver bullet?
Yeah.
I want to actually unpack some of the language here, even the language in the BrightHire tagline, for our listeners that are maybe newer to what AI is and the different I guess words literally that are describing how AI is working. One of them, Copilot.
Yep.
So the AI Copilot for exceptional hiring. Tell us more about what is a Copilot, and how might talent teams today think about a Copilot and think about embracing AI
Yep.
today, and how that's different from teams of the past, more of the
Yep.
automation or manual recruiting mindsets. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I'd say historically, automation's great, when it works, like it's a really powerful, awesome thing that creates a lot of efficiency. And so that's existed in some form or fashion for a while. I'd say like actually the adoption of automation is still not, I would say there's a lot of running room. I don't know if that's.
There's a lag in recruiting teams still, even embracing full automation.
There's still a lot of opportunities in automation, but automation itself and tools around that have been around for a while in a bunch of different areas, whether it's like scheduling or sequencing or, just sort of these routinized tasks that can take up a lot of time. The term Copilot we use because it's kind of more of a recognizable term now, but if you looked at our pitch deck from 5 years ago, we were more or less saying the same thing. The idea was this heart of the hiring, interviewing is the heart of the hiring process, all the activities I just described, and it's very hard. And what if technology can make it way easier for everyone to be much more successful doing that job day in, day out? Now, the way that we support folks doing the job day in, day out has gotten more sophisticated over the last 5 years as we've integrated more sophisticated AI. But the idea is very simple. It's like we're not replacing people in the parts of the process that we support. We're like, wow, people can be way better at hiring if they're given the right technology. So the first version of our product 5 years ago was like, we run interviews because they're important. If they weren't important, we wouldn't do them. Maybe, just maybe, it would be helpful if we remembered them like perfectly.
Yeah.
So what if we captured them so that you didn't have to struggle to remember this really important conversation? Because that's why we do them in the first place.
Yeah.
There's like one very simple example. Now, so that's what a Copilot is. It's riding alongside folks as they're doing a job and hopefully making it much easier and making folks much more successful and to some extent saving time. And so that's the role that we occupy, again, across the entire interview process in a whole bunch of places.
Well said. I think, I kind of want to shout like louder for the people in the back. And what I'm hearing you say, and when I talk to, talent leaders, what I'm hearing is talent teams that are embracing TA tools like BrightHire and others just across the stack, but more shifting the mindset of recruiting teams to be more efficient and adopt or implement automation and AI across the interview process and across the recruiting process from top of funnel and reach out through onboarding.
Yep.
Essentially what we're seeing is these incremental efficiencies in output. And really what that means is we're saving time as TA teams. So across the board, sourcers, recruiters, coordinators, hiring managers, stakeholders internally, everyone is saving time and therefore saving money for the organization. And that's why this is so important, to talk about. And I myself, I can chime in and say, like, I've been a recruiter for over 15 years and built and sold recruiting companies, and I still use tools to this day to stay sharp. And what I can say that I see happening is people that people in the TA function that adopt an open-minded, forward-thinking, uncomfortable and embracing change period end up seeing that efficiency, that output.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's this resistance to change, or maybe it's it's tough to teach an old dog new tricks. Curious, kind of a curveball question, but when you talk about adoption with TA teams, how does that go when you implement BrightHire with a new customer? How is adoption? Can you talk about the trends that you see with customers and TA team adoption?
It's a great question. I'm kind of thinking about it for a second. I think
Yeah.
it's probably changed over time for a few different reasons. It's changed over time in part because of market awareness and kind of the natural adoption cycle of new technology. It's also changed over time because the nature of our product has changed. So today, I feel no reservation saying that when we roll out BrightHire to a recruiting team, I mean, they're like, the feedback's amazing. I mean, and
You're probably like shouting in the halls, like,
yeah,
we want this.
I would say, like, go talk to any of our customers, like whether their logo's on the website or not,
Yeah.
go talk to them. But because it's great, like it saves you time, makes your job easier, gives you a perfect memory, helps you collaborate better. I mean, I'm a hiring manager, I'm a recruiter, I experience it day in, day out. It's really great. Honestly, I would say 3 years ago or 4 years ago, probably more mixed. And that it was like probably a distribution of adoption, in part because it was a newer paradigm, right? And folks like to see social proof or
Yep.
get used to things. And so now there's so much more social proof around, something like, what we do being of value. And then in part because the technology has changed. At that time, 4 years ago, we didn't have, large language models and some of the things that we do today that have made the product, truly unbelievable, right? So some of the efficiency wasn't necessarily like abundantly as clear. I would say 3 or 4 years ago, the quality was always there. We were always there to support quality and sort of like consistency and equity in a bunch of
Yes.
different ways.
Yes.
But the efficiency wasn't necessarily like abundantly clear on a day by day basis. There was not like a day one painkiller in terms of time savings. And people love convenience, right? So that actually makes a massive difference. When you layer that on top of, being able to raise the bar on quality and better collaborate and have and all the other things that we can do, it's a big, it's an important combination.
One of my favorite parts is just simply people in general forget things easily. I'll just say myself, like, when I'm before a tool like BrightHire, I would literally transcribe either at my machine or sometimes, and I still have recruiters on my teams today who use pen and paper.
Yep.
And there's a massive room for error there with forgetting something or transcribing something incorrectly. And so I think that, I want to talk a bit about the word you used a moment ago of equity and also, but tie that into how the tech helps people get there. And I think one of the ways simply is just like removing mistakes that people make
100%
through the, accurate, recording, but also synthesis of the content. And then ultimately what we arrive with is just the true snapshot of the interaction. And we can go discover that again. We can search that again. We can look that up again. And so I think that, like, inherently being able to accurately record and summarize and talk about a conversation, whether it's a recruiting phone screen or maybe a closing call or what have you, would create more equity in the hiring process. So can you tell us a bit? I want to start like high level with like just what you've seen with customers talk about equity changes or observations after implementing BrightHire. And then so spicy question, part 2 is the observations you've seen, but then how have you seen equity change since this new administration has come in? There's been a lot of changes high level, right?
Yeah. Let me start with describing the way that we support that, objective.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about, kind of how it shows up in the day-to-day of actually, customers using the product and then like any, the changes that have occurred. our role as it relates to making the process more equitable. And by the way, our mission statement from day one for the company was give everyone the hiring experience they deserve. And before I was, well, I wouldn't say before I was, like in the HR world, because I've been in that space for a while, but there was a period of time where I was also very focused on just like personally on this idea of like education and economic empowerment and like what a job really means for somebody's economic empowerment and their identity. So I care, and Teddy care, we both care a lot about the other side of the table, and that's part of the mission. And so it was really, I mean, I remember like the early text message exchanges when we were discussing the idea of doing BrightHire, and this is again 5.5 years ago. Part of those text messages were like, this would be so much better for the candidate, for a bunch of different reasons. And so the way that we support that objective in terms of equity is, one, let's have a process, an assessment process that's focused on the things that actually matter. So we help, a hiring team, recruiter, et cetera, if they don't have a really defined scope and understanding of what matters for role, like what are the core competencies and skills, let's make sure that that solid foundation's in place, because ultimately, how can you possibly evaluate someone effectively for a role if you're really not even sure what you're looking for and what matters? So let's take that foundation, and then let's build a plan to assess for it across the interview process, and then let's do that. Let's execute on that plan with consistency and rigor. And so having a structured and consistent process, tends to lead to more equitable hiring, as opposed to an unstructured process that where you're talking about different things with different people and all sorts of biases can come into play. And more importantly, you just don't get useful signal. So you have to fall back on making your decisions around things that don't relate to the actual signal of the requirements of the role, because you haven't defined that and assessed for those clearly. So the role that we play is let's help you build, let's help create a solid foundation for what we should assess for. We have some tools around job descriptions and making sure we're articulating what matters in a job description to the market inclusively and accurately. Let's build a structured plan and let's help operationalize that. Like literally, when we run interviews, BrightHire is going to pull the plan into the interview in Zoom, Teams, Meet, phone for the interviewer to like guide and help reinforce that structure. We're going to gather data. When I say data, I mean the evidence, the qualifications the candidate shares from the interviews, and we're going to summarize that automatically. One of the ways we summarize it, if you have structure in your process, is against that structure. So you're actually viewing the qualifications of the candidate with sort of perfect recall, but also in a structure that's based on what you said was important, and then bringing accountability into the decision making. You talked about taking pen and paper notes, and maybe you remember things, maybe you don't. That's a really important part of it for the individual who's the interviewer or the hiring manager to like remember what happened in their conversation. I would say an equally important part is think of every really important, really expensive decision you make in your personal, professional life. Like you're buying a car or something. If I was to buy a car, with my spouse, we would both look at the car together. We would read about the car. We would maybe visit it. If you do like an important due diligence a transaction business, everyone's looking at the same diligence materials. And historically, hiring was like virtually one of the only really important, expensive decisions where only one person could actually see the evidence that they experienced. Like I have my version of Ben and you have your version of Ben, and those are different versions of Ben, and we actually can't collaborate. And the importance of collaboration is triangulating perspectives, bringing accountability. Everyone's bringing a different point of view to the table. And by capturing, interviews, you can do that. You can give me feedback about a candidate, and then I can put that feedback into perfect information symmetry, perspective. I can say, great, I looked at that, the piece of feedback, and I looked at the interview about, where XYZ happened, and I can develop my own perspective on that, and then we can talk about it. And it removes a lot of, challenges associated with hiring historically, where it's like, do I have to overrule you even though I wasn't in the room? How are you going to feel if I overrule you on your feedback and I wasn't there?
Yeah.
And so a lot of other things come into play. So our role is, create a foundation of structure, consistency, rigor, evidence-based decision-making, and then gather data on the back end that allows us to really understand, are we doing a good job? Are we executing against the plan? Are we being rigorous and following guides? Are we giving everyone the sort of the same interview process? And so on and so forth. So a little long-winded, but that's the role that we play. And it shows up for our customers day in, day out. I mean, again, it's not a dashboard that measures like, throughput of the pipeline by, candidate background, and that we look at and then we try to wonder like, what's going on there? It's an actual, the platform is showing up as the job of hiring is happening and reinforcing the behaviors that should lead to more equitable and kind of outcomes. And as it relates to like the current administration and in this realm, it doesn't foundationally change what we do. I mean, I'll talk about the market. I think
Yeah, anecdotally, yeah.
companies are concerned about whether they're a government contractor or not. They're concerned about if they're a government contractor, they're worried about breaking the law. And it's like, frankly, based on, formal inclusion of, DEI or what have you practices. And there's a lot of, there's not a lot of clarity for them as it relates to what they can do or not do. That's what I'm seeing. It's like companies that want to have equitable practices, but they also don't want to break a law or become the crosshairs of the administration, particularly if they're a larger enterprise and they actually reasonably could. I'd say that's probably a little bit less the case if the folks are not government contractors or on the smaller side, because it's, they're just not in that position. At the end of the day, even the administration talks about it, being meritocracy or equitable hiring. Like the practices of structure and rigor and accountability are universal. Yeah. So, and I think universally acknowledged as being important. So I don't think that has changed at all. And I think folks have, in my perspective of when talking to folks in market, whether they're clients or not, is, everyone appreciates the value of that as it relates to, having more overall equity in the process, removing bias, and so forth.
One of the things so much just resonated and came up for me, but I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to have dozens of guests, talent and tech experts like yourself on the show, and talk to hundreds of people the last couple of years as we've scoped and planned the show. And there's this word that keeps coming up. There's kind of this theme that keeps coming up with hiring teams today, and whether publicly traded or there's a board or a C-suite of a growth stage company, they're saying like, look, we really want talent leaders to focus on quality.
Yep.
And create a process, a measurable process where we can say, hey, talent teams, you're now responsible even in some cases for measuring that quality. And some folks might call that quality of hire. Some folks might say, which hones in on the quantitative, so signals and measurable concepts, or more like attributes a candidate has, and also the qualitative parts too of hiring someone and building a talent dense team.
Yep.
I think that, I guess anecdotally, or what I've seen is maybe this almost like this vernacular shift, but the end goal is still the same of creating talent dense teams that are with diverse backgrounds of talented groups of people, whether we're talking purely tech folks, non-tech folks, whatever it might be, if you're building a sales team or an engineering team, what have you. Unpack more about that concept of building talent dense teams and the measurable part of quality of hire, how that's it living in your BrightHire ecosystem.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, look, yes, that's definitely become much more core to the vernacular, certainly versus 2021 as an example, where it was like, we just need people as fast as humanly possible because we're all blitzscaling or hyperscaling. And there's a bunch of reasons for, I think there's probably 3 or 4 reasons for why that's come to the fore. I mean, the first and foremost was, there was an economic pullback. And so teams were, had to, less folks, right? They couldn't, if there was a problem to solve, they couldn't just solve it by having just, throwing more people at the problem and hiring, sort of unabashedly. So you have less folks. So the performance of every one of the people that you have kind of takes more of a central role. You might have less open headcounts. You kind of have to like get the most out of every person that you're adding.
Yeah.
And be real. And so that put that into clear focus. And there was sort of the emergence of, and there's been, continues to be the emergence of like this idea of how AI can be a real accelerator and kind of improve the productivity of everybody in your team. And so I think that's actually magnified it because now, there's another kind of force pushing companies to sort of see how productive they can be without, scaling, their organization, exponentially in terms of headcount. But also there's this idea of, incredibly, talent dense teams empowered by AI can get amazing things done. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the second thing. And the third thing was there were just examples of, I think there's been a founder shift in Silicon Valley in particular, but tech, I think specifically where, folks think, We actually want like small, nimble teams that, work rapidly. And that's actually much more productive than, bigger multi-level teams with more hierarchy. All of those things
Middle
have been
management.
a driver
Yeah.
for quality of hire, talent density, raising the bar, et cetera. As it relates to what does that mean? Is that the next question? Like, what is the bar? How do we set it? Like, what does this mean? Yeah, I'm happy to kind of weigh in on that as well. I think I'd say most companies are not really that far along the maturity curve as it relates to measuring quality of hire, and lots of
And
folks want
confirm.
to.
And confirm. Yeah. There's a
Yeah,
lot of how do I do this questions I get. Yeah.
yeah. There's different approaches you can take to measuring quality of hire. You can take a generic approach, meaning you take,
Mhm.
you know, if a quality hire is, the lifetime contribution, total contribution and value add of
Yeah.
an
Sure.
employee, that's a function of the amount of value they add and, how long they're in your business. There are some standard metrics that you can gather, and you can create, sort of a imperfect, perhaps directionally accurate, or directionally indicator quality of hire metric, like tenure, performance ratings, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are flaws to all of those metrics, which is the challenge. Tenure could be like, maybe they shouldn't be in the business that long. Maybe we should have performance managed them better, or performance reviews can be influenced by the biases of their manager, or like how well they were onboarded. There's like a lot of confounding factors. The value of that approach is you develop a singular metric and it's apples to apples, and you can, sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
use it across your business. The other side the other approach is pick specific high leverage roles in your business, that exist in great numbers, and develop role specific granular
Yeah.
measures of performance. Sales is like the obvious example, maybe engineering, maybe customer success. And then you look at, what are the behaviors that and the outcomes that, exist when someone's a high performer, hitting quota or
Yeah.
code or what have you. But you develop something that's like very role specific, because at the end of the day, success is very role specific. And the value there is these are high leverage roles, so it's worth all of the effort and energy to try to, figure out a way to measure quality of hire in a role specific way. And then there's a middle ground where you build a robust, really nuanced. And we have, a few customers that are really, really smart and very far along the journey, and they've, developed both like complex ways to measure it that they do use across their organization that tie back to, kind of universal behaviors that, they view
Yeah.
as really
Yeah.
indicative of high performance across all roles. And then they measure them over time in structured reviews and so it's those sorts of things. So like, it's all hard though, right? Because you need a data availability, you need to align people on to agree that that's the right quality of hire metric. You need to have confidence that those metrics actually do tie to quality, et cetera, et cetera. But worth doing because it allows you to measure performance. The thing I would argue though is, as it relates to talent acquisition and hiring, jumping straight to how do we measure this really complicated version of quality of hire is like skipping first and second and third base and trying to go straight to home. And it really should start, in my view, with quality of process, meaning if the objective is to increase quality of hire over time, if you run a random hiring process, you will have no mechanism to increase the quality of hire over time. You're
Okay.
running a random process, you will get random results.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
no optimizations that you can,
Yeah.
like introduce to the process. So the starting point is, do we have quality of process and is it consistent? And you can do that in parallel to also trying to develop measures of quality of hire. But if you have a random process, if you haven't solidified it, even if it's not the world's best process, at least if it's consistent, you kind of understand, you can make measurable, clear improvements and then see the results. Versus if you're running a random process, you have no mechanism in the hiring, in terms of hiring to move the needle. Like even if you had a perfect measure, you would have no idea how to move the needle because you don't have any infrastructure to do so.
Yeah, I can confirm, operational rigor and often talent leaders with ops backgrounds are certainly a pattern that I'm seeing today.
Yep.
Years past, you used to see, a
Yep.
lot of talent leaders maybe ended up in that role as an agency recruiter promoted for production, or maybe, whatever their path was. And now I talk to a lot of folks that ended up in a TA role through M&A or through being, a COO or operator at a startup or some other domain. And then they ended up in tech as a talent leader. So I
Yep.
can confirm that recruiting today is almost, I talked to someone recently who said, recruiting and talent teams in many ways mirror go to sales teams where
Yep.
we maybe maybe there's a lag or a latency of a couple of years where there's this rigor in sales teams, and then they'll implement, automation and then AI or whatever the process is. And then boom, now sales teams are more efficient, and then recruiting follows that process. And I think they're not wrong in many ways, because today recruiting teams, one of the main themes I'm hearing talent leaders say is like, Anders, we're implementing operational rigor. We're measuring this. We need tools that can solve this. They have to be saving this certain amount of time to have the
Totally.
investment worth it. And really what this all comes down to is there is this operational efficiency, I think, regardless of what was happening in the economy, that needed to happen to TA teams.
Mhm.
Because of the growth at all costs mindset, I think that there was a lot of bloat, not just with the team size, but with the process itself. And so that rigor is now being more, of course, looked at because of the down market that we just came out of. And so I think both of those force functions force TA teams to really look at how they scale efficiently, not just with the tools and the text, but the process. Kind of a curveball question, but more esoteric question of like, when you look at a new customer, a BrightHire customer, or even just in general, the recruiting process as
Yep.
it is today, if you had a magic wand and could change it, like where do you see the most inefficiency in a recruiting process? And if you could, wave that magic wand and change that one part end to end from reach out to hire, where is if TA leaders are listening in to what you're about to say, where is that place in the process that they can just wave the magic wand?
Man, there's so many. No.
There are.
If you're thinking about the part of the process that where the inefficiency actually adds up to the most time, drag, et
Yeah.
cetera, writ large. So, like, what's interesting about our product and what we do, there's actually enormous efficiencies to be gained if we're just talking about like making the business more efficient. There are big efficiencies that can certainly be gained in areas that are, kind of like more administrative, as it
Oh, yeah.
relates to things
Yeah.
like scheduling and those sorts of things, like for sure. What gets us excited and what's interesting about what we're doing is we touch a part of the process that is not just the recruiting team. You might have a recruiting team that's 20 folks, and then like the organization is thousands or hundreds, right? And so the time spent in the interview process is spent by everybody.
Yeah.
And so if you can make the interview process more efficient, that adds up to like an enormous amount of time. But it's not just giving time back for the recruiting team, which we do, to spend, on higher value activities or
Yeah. Yeah.
delivering a better candidate experience. It's literally giving time back to like sales people to sell, engineers
Yeah.
to code, CS people to, prepare for their QBR.
Funny how that
And
works.
so that's not just automation of tasks within the interview process. Yes, we, summarize your notes and save you 10 minutes, 15 minutes in, an interview or something. But what we find is when our clients we did a study of, 24 clients, 25,000 candidates, and like a very granular kind of
Wow.
before and after comparison of key metrics from their hiring process before and after same roles. And one of the most interesting data points we found was if you add up all the interviews that are required to make one hire, all the phone, all the recruiter screens, all the hiring manager screens, all the on-site
Yeah.
interviews, not like the length of a loop, but the total number of interviews to get to one hire for one role. Before it was say like 30, and that's like 10 phone screens, 5 hiring manager interviews, a couple on-sites. We found that after deploying our product, our clients saw that get reduced by nearly 30%, not quite 30%. But like imagine having a whole company hiring hundreds or thousands of people a year and the amount of interviews you do. And if you could take out 30% of those, like, and not just the time spent interviewing, but the time spent scheduling those interviews,
Yeah.
debriefing, feedback, that is a massive amount of time. And that comes from a bunch of things, like the process more efficient, less candidates drop out, less false negatives, more confidence in decision making, better calibration. Like all those things add up to just we're spending time with the
The
right
aggregate is
candidates and
huge.
we're moving more efficiently to decision on them basically.
Yeah. 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 Wow. That's insightful. As you look, so where we are today, things are very dynamic in the market, early
Yep.
2025. So when you look next year, let's go 12 months. You have this crystal ball, right? Ben's crystal ball for the talent in the tech space, a year from now, and then 3 years from now. The rate of change is pretty rapid. And so I'm curious what you think, based on, your current role, co-founder, CEO of BrightHire. You have a lot of signal from these, tech
Yep.
companies that are implementing AI. So maybe a
Yep.
better real world awareness of where the world might be a year from now and 3 years from now. So if our audience of people and talent leaders are tuning in and need to prepare for the change that's coming, what would you say when you speak to them about the change you see coming 1 year and 3 years from now?
Yeah, it's happening very quickly. I would say, look, the digitization era, right? Going from resumes to, like digital software that store candidates in an ATM, certainly was beneficial. It was certainly beneficial for companies in terms of like record keeping and organization and data. But the software didn't, it was like still kind of, sometimes it felt like it got in the way, right? Like not just in our category, like in any
Yeah.
category, like a CRM. And that's like a foundational change, where the technology is now working for folks in a bunch of ways that are very, very valuable. And the capabilities for the technology to work for you is extraordinarily high, again, I'm not just talking about recruiting. I use AI a lot, in our company and my personal life. It's amazing what you can accomplish, with with technology as your co-pilot.
Yeah.
And so I've never seen sentiment around tech adoption change so quickly. I won't get into some specifics, but there's,
Yeah.
certain technology, certain applications of technology within the recruiting space where if you think about automation, like sequencing or automated scheduling, like it's been around for a long time, and there's still a lot of companies that don't do it. Um, but some of the technologies that have arisen in the last year, if I was to talk to a bunch of folks 6 months ago, they might have seemed like just for the bleeding edge, and the rate at which they're moving into the early majority or the majority, to use sort of like the crossing the chasm language, is as fast as I've ever seen. And I think it's because of a bunch of things. I think companies writ large understand, like, if I am the CEO, the board understands, if we are not leveraging this modern game changing technology, it's like the big book retailer 98 who was like, who's going to buy books on the internet? That seems silly. You want to read them, you want to thumb the pages.
Yeah.
Like, people don't want to be in that position, and it's a competitive disadvantage. So there's a pressure from the top,
Yeah.
not just for recruiting, but for all functions in the business, of like, this is not just for technology's sake. It's truly a game-changing technology if used, the correct way. And we can't be skittish about that, because we're going to fall behind as a business. That's one driver of accelerating the adoption. And I think another one is, and hopefully we're a part of that, there are truly valuable applications where it's not, there's a bunch of applications that are just promise and, like maybe there's a letdown, but there's just really practically very useful applications. And when folks experience that, it kind of opens the door to considering other really valuable, useful applications, which is a long-winded way of saying, if you're not leaning into these technologies, your peers are going to do so, and they're going to do so at a very high rate. And you're going to feel it's going to feel very antiquated very quickly if you're not, using any of this technology, using technology that's available
Yeah.
in the job, whether it be very recruiting specific work or whether it be just integrating AI into the work that you do day to day.
Yep.
And that's not even a recruiting tool. It's just using it in the way that you execute. So I think the changes are going to come quickly. Historically, certain categories of the market tend to adopt some of this technology sooner than others. So high volume is always very much an early adopter around things like automation and those sorts of things. So there will be certain segments that will lean into certain technologies even faster. But just generally speaking, I've never seen it move so.
That good answer, and a lot resonated for me as you were answering that. And I was reflecting on my own personal life, right? And I answered this question a year ago, and it's an earlier episode on the podcast, and I think I can confirm that my adoption of AI, and whether it's full Copilot or even lighter, watered down versions of AI in my personal and work life, have accelerated. I don't know, anecdotally, a lot more than I thought a year ago, and so it's almost sobering to look back and think, wow.
Why do you think that's been the case? I'm curious.
So I think that I have some skepticism, healthy skepticism as a talent leader, where I've seen these waves. I've seen technology come and promise us to solve this. The phrase silver bullet comes in. Talent leader will tell me, Anders, the C-suite thinks there's this silver bullet, and I'm supposed to X the productivity, and I can't promise them that, but how can I do something measurable and incremental? And then we have a talk about how we can do that with tools and people and services. But back to the 12 months from now answer. So my answer would be even more aggressive, much more aggressive than it was 12 months ago. And here's why.
Totally.
I have used AI increasingly in my personal life and seen it change the way I make educated decisions with things that are sometimes less interesting, like umbrella insurance or buying a new car or
Yeah.
in a
Find me a camp for my 6-year-old this summer. Yeah.
yeah, and just implementing like the way that I use AI in work in my personal life and seeing the efficiency happen there, even with seeing how like, Copilot or full self-driving in a car is as effective as it is in some cars today. And I was skeptical before I saw that and, rode in a Waymo or rode in a Tesla and saw that. And then once you experience that and go, oh
Yep.
shit, no, this is
Yep.
here. So for me, it was more of a hands-on
Yeah.
demonstration and seeing like this is changing my personal life and professional life with output. So now I would put my flag in the sand and say more like, or I'll speak to the audience more and just say, in summary, like investigate and implement and just try, whether it's a demo with BrightHire or a sourcing tool or in your personal life. And you just want to like make an educated decision with a new thing you're doing, like your kid's camp or a car, try it and see what happens. And
Yep.
at least for me, the stickiness is there. And now I can't imagine how I made such well-informed decisions before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. The more that you use products, just even personally, and you see capabilities, it gives you a level of not just confidence, but inevitability of the level of change, and it accelerates. I'm fortunate to run this company, and be an AI company, and be in the weeds on it day in day out, because we talk about every new foundational model improvement or, sort of new discovery or, leap forward internally because it touches our product and our business.
Yeah.
And there's not a day that goes by where we're not sharing an update from, along those lines, where there's not a new model that's released or a new capability or and so the large language models have gotten wildly more capable. The reasoning models have emerged in the last 12 months with new capabilities. This idea of, building agentic workflows or agents has become,
The buzzword of the day. Yeah.
yeah, the word of the day. I like corner someone and ask them to define it. I can define it, I think, but it is powerful, right? It's this idea of, we don't have to spell out, this just singular deterministic path for technology to accomplish something. Technology can accomplish something with a goal and some constraints and some access to data, and it'll figure out the way and solve it the best way possible. That's powerful. Just like very simply, that is a powerful concept, and it's true. So there's gonna be a lot of change.
Yeah. Yeah, there sure will. So, it's interesting to see, I'm sure a year from now when we reconnect, maybe episode round 2, 12 months, we'll book it, see see how
You'll have my
accurate
deep fake. It won't be me. I'll have a deep fake.
yeah, it'll be a deep figure and avatar. I mean, who
Yeah,
knows?
yeah, exactly.
Hey, I appreciate the words of wisdom. Honestly, I've learned a lot in all of our chats. Grateful for your time. I'm sure our audience is too. So, Ben, thanks for joining the Lean In podcast and grateful for your time on the show today. Take
No,
care.
likewise. I love the podcast. I appreciate you having me, and it's always fun to talk about what we do and talk about the future and just the state of TA. And we're in a really interesting spot right now, but I think it's a spot that's really exciting, actually, and a huge opportunity. So
It
looking
is.
forward to
It's an
hopefully
exciting time. Lots of change,
contributing.
and it seems like it's for the positive. The mood in the room is definitely optimistic. So
Absolutely.
I'm an optimist at heart. So on that note, thanks, man. Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anders.